So, spring is here, and that can only mean one thing.
Winter is coming.
The HBO fantasy series Game of Thrones begins a new season this Sunday. Stephen, why do you think Game of Thrones is still such a massive phenomenon?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of reasons for it. I think one is that it like a lot of fantasies and like a lot of these massively popular fantasy novels, it derives most of its presence from these antique English stories, right? These ancient stories derived from Arthurian legends and the prehistory of English literature. And those stories are powerful. They always work. I mean, there's a reason why the best-selling book of the 20th century is Lord of the Rings. But you know, I think another reason is that its politics is so attractive and its brutality is so attractive. And, you know, I think we live in a world of manners. We live in a world of measuring tone, where that actually, and then you come to this show, and it's like, oh, it's just pure Machiavellianism, and it's very clear, and that clarity I think is very attractive.
There's something attractive about that.
Yeah.
Rachel, why do you think the show is still such a massive phenomenon at this point?
I think it had a built-in audience, right? So, it's based on these hugely popular series by George R.R. Martin. So there was already an audience. It landed at HBO, which was known for doing sort of, outre television, stuff that was sexier, a little bit more graphic. And the show is gorgeous to look at. It looks like prestige television. It's beautifully shot. I think they fly everyone over to Croatia or something to film it there. So, it's stunning. There are gorgeous people. There's lots of naked bodies,
yeah.
Which I think is a big part of it, right? I mean, and I think it hits all the pleasure centers of that kind of speculative storytelling, that kind of fantasy storytelling. So, you've got stark gender roles. As Steve said, it's lawless. There's this power structure. There are high stakes. There's death and sex and characters that people feel very strongly about.
Norm, I know you're not a fan of the show, but at the same time, you know exactly what's happening on the show.
Yeah.
What does that tell? What does that tell us about
it?
Yeah.
It is. I think it's probably a bigger cultural phenomenon than it is an actual viewership phenomenon. HBO doesn't have to release numbers; they are a subscription series, so they don't worry about subscription service, so they don't worry about ratings. And obviously, it's successful because they keep making it, even though it's really, really expensive. But I drifted away fairly early on. It's awfully rapey.
Yeah. To me, it's the dragons.
The dragons are very rapey.
That's just a line in the sand for me.
Me too.
I can do vampires. I can do werewolves. I wrote a werewolf novel, but dragons. It's just like I can't do it.
I draw the line at dragons.
Yeah.
So just the thing I keep coming back to is, and you guys both did touch on, it's like it's Lord of the Rings, but you can touch yourself to it.
Right.
And it creeps me out. I love the fact that they are employing almost all of the UK. They shoot a lot of it in Dublin, Belfast. Belfast, Croatia, a couple of other places. I've interviewed actors who have never met the other cast members because they shoot on different they shoot in different parts of the world. It's kind of amazing. I think they shot some stuff in Iceland too for The Wall. And it is so huge and complex that it immediately draws in people who love huge and complex stories, The Lord of the Rings. Like if you can name all the pieces of Westeros, you are already winning. And there's that whole Dungeons and Dragons appeal. And as a kid who read a lot of fantasy novels and science fiction, I was mostly hard sci-fi because I was a huge nerd. But
no halfway for you.
Right,
No. You do the whole thing. You
Right,
read
yeah.
You read Childhood's End when you're in childhood. That's how it goes.
So there is this built-in niche audience. At the same time, as you said, it may be more of a cultural phenomenon than it is a viewership.
Yeah, it feeds
phenomenon.
on itself, right? So
Yeah.
you see the images, and HBO, they're owned by Time Warner. They're a huge conglomerate, so of course they're promoted everywhere. It's the same way The Sopranos became a cultural phenomenon before people actually got into the show, and then people realized, oh, this is actually great television. But you have to see it before you see it in a weird way. And with Game of Thrones, it's incessant. Like the advertising is everywhere. They're on the cover of Entertainment Weekly every 3 weeks because they know Entertainment Weekly knows that will sell magazines. I don't think the show is necessarily as important as the culture that's built up around it. Certainly the books are driving people insane that George R.R. Martin just announced yesterday that he has an idea for a television spinoff, and they're like, finish your books. We want the books. And I made a joke about on Twitter about how the spinoff is going to be about this awesome TV writer who runs around having adventures and not writing. And people actually responded seriously, like, he can do whatever he wants, okay? He's really successful now. And I'm like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care.
Well, a big part of the conversation around the show, as we've already discussed, there's lots of sex on the show, lots of violence on the show, lots of sexualized violence on the show.
That was what turned me off.
And last season was maybe its most brutal yet, with the rape of Sansa Stark and the humiliation of Queen Cersei. Rachel, what did you make of those depictions?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think the show is really divisive in that way because I think that Game of Thrones wants to sort of walk that narrow line between telling real within the realm of fantasy stories about a world in which rape is a constant threat, where some women have access to power, but even that access to power is a very tricky one and unstable, and where women are treated like chattel. And so to expose that, which I think that there's a real life existence of that for women. So on one hand, it's exposing what happens to women when they experience this kind of violence. And the other is the pornification and the exploitation of that sexual violence. And I think that there are viewers who watch the show and feel like it is telling honest stories about what it means to be a woman in this realm. And then I think there are people who watch the show who get off on that violence towards women. And so I think that's a tricky thing. And I think that there is a lot of there are shows like, Law and Order SVU or CSI where they become a constant sort of it does have almost a porn quality to seeing female suffering, and there's lots of shows and that for me get to a point where I cannot see another naked body of a dead brutalized woman, where it just seems to be almost like ambient or the backdrop, and I think that's one of the failings of Game of Thrones.
And it makes me skeptical of that defense that this is what happens in reality, or this is what happened. This show is based on medieval history, for example, because there are other things that happened that were equally brutal but have no sexiness to them, and they aren't depicted. So it makes me skeptical a little bit of that defense.
Oh yeah, this is post-porn Lord of the Rings, right? Like that's what it is. It's like it's just when people are just absolutely inured to sexual imagery, you have to find a way to be gratuitous in a whole new way. I mean, they invented the term sexposition to describe the narrative trick in this movie, in this television show.
It came from The Sopranos, actually, because they shot the scenes at the Bada Bing to get all the dialogue in, because then they could have topless women.
Then they could have it, but this is the one that's really taken
they
to the extreme aspect. I mean, The Sopranos did that a little bit.
Oh,
but,
no, they did
it a
here
lot
it's
more
like
than we remember. You're in a bedroom, there's a guy having sex, and then they explain the plot. They can't be bothered to actually write in. I mean, it's really something.
This show is in its sixth season. I'll ask this question to you, Norm.
Sure.
It's in its sixth season. Culture has actually changed quite a bit in that time. Do you think that's going to affect the plots and some of these things we've been discussing that go on in the show?
I don't think they're going to affect. I think if they were, it would have happened by now. I think certainly the fact that last year, and I didn't watch the season, but I know this, that Sansa was raped in the show to prove a point structurally, apparently, but they took that from a different character's assault in the books. They just put the rape on Sansa in order to have somewhere to go with that character. So that tells me they're not really valuing individual journeys so much as how do we work the stuff that we want to work into the films, into the show. And to talk to Stephen's point about the post-porn aesthetic, the post-porn aesthetic, it's absolutely true. The lighting choices are what tell me that it's exploitative. You can shoot this stuff in a way that's disturbing and upsetting. You can shoot this stuff in a way that's kitchen sink reality, or you can make sure the light glances off someone's underboob as they're thrown down against the floor. And that was one of the things in the first couple of seasons that just pushed me away.
I was talking to a female filmmaker once, and she was talking about how you shoot scenes where a woman is being assaulted. And she said, one of the ways you can get that across is that you stay on the woman's face.
Yeah.
And so what you see is sort of her experience of emotion. So you stay with her as the subject.
Yeah,
you don't turn
make
her
it pleasant for the viewer.
and you don't make her the object, and you don't exploit it or expose her in that way. You show the emotions going across her face, which is a very compelling way to talk about what it's like to experience a trauma like that without the possibility of someone maybe getting off on that.
Yeah, and that's how they did it in, remember the Jones rape scene in Mad Men was exactly that. It was just a close-up of her face. And I remember it was such a heartbreaking, moving scene and one that you don't see.
No.
Yeah,
and it's the exact opposite of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Mad Men is a show that's undeniably more sympathetic to its female characters. Yeah. And there's actually a short film at Hot Docs, a short documentary called What Happened to Her, which is just 15 minutes of clips from television shows of dead female corpses, and it's incredibly powerful. It's just body after body after body, often played by actors, sometimes played by mannequins. But it just shows you the aesthetic treatment of this sort of thing. And weirdly, I don't think Game of Thrones is in there at all, because probably couldn't get the rights.